There's a quiet moment that betrays us all. The instant you feel utterly right. Not just confident, but righteous. You know the feeling. Someone challenges you, and instead of curiosity, a strange heat rises. The words form faster than thought. You're not just defending a point, you're defending your worth. And underneath that conviction, there's a pulse of irritation that feels holy. That's the sign, the most dangerous one. Because it feels like moral clarity, but it's often the ego swelling with borrowed power. Jung warned about this kind of inflation. The moment the ego fuses with something archetypal, something larger than itself. It believes it's serving truth, but really, it's serving its own survival. In modern life, this possession wears a pleasant mask. The good man, the reasonable man, the one who plays fair, apologizes when he should, tries to do what's right. But here's the paradox. The more you identify with that image, the more brittle it becomes. When others don't mirror that goodness back, it doesn't just sting, it threatens your entire sense of identity. So the tone hardens, the jaw sets. You start policing conversations, quietly hunting for where others are wrong. You call it clarity, but what's actually happening is a drift away from presence. Your nervous system slips into defense, while your mind insists you're just standing on principle. Psychologically, this is the ego caught in conflict with the shadow, the parts of you that don't fit the image of who you think you are. Spiritually, it's a split between light and dark, where the light becomes blinding. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits, gathering strength in the unconscious, until it begins to act through you. You think you're protecting your values. In truth, your values are protecting your fear. This tension, the one between being good and being whole, is not new. Cultures have worshipped it for centuries. The saint becomes the persecutor. The healer becomes the tyrant. The hero becomes the monster he swore to defeat. Jung saw this in myths, in politics, and in private hearts. When the ego identifies with goodness, it starts doing evil in its name, not out of malice, but blindness. And blindness, in psychological terms, isn't lack of intelligence. It's moral anesthesia. It's what happens when the nervous system is flooded and the mind defends coherence over truth. You're no longer seeing, you're maintaining a self-story. Kahneman would say, System 1, the fast, instinctive process, takes the wheel. You feel certain, but certainty has replaced consciousness. If you've ever felt that surge of rightness in conflict, and noticed how quickly love disappears from your tone, that's what this series of moments is about. Because the danger isn't in being wrong, it's in being possessed by the idea of being right. That possession rewrites relationships, drains tenderness, and isolates you in moral armor. This is where we start, with the sign that hides inside your virtues, the one that turns self-respect into superiority, clarity into control, care into covert pride. It moves quietly, fed by wounds you've never named. The goal here isn't to shame that instinct, but to meet it, to trace its origins, to see how it begins and why it feeds on good intentions. So take a breath, feel your shoulders. Let the body remind you that awareness isn't attack, it's contact. You're not being judged here, you're being seen. We'll follow this thread together, through the ways virtue turns predatory, how relationships mirror the shadow you avoid, and how control disguises fear. Each stage reveals a part of the psyche that wants something simple, to be integrated, not exiled. The sign you don't notice until it owns you is the one that looks most like your best self. And if you can recognize it early, if you can pause when the heat of righteousness first rises, something softer re-enters the room. Clarity without hostility, strength without theater. Let's begin with where that light first turns sharp. The halo that bites when virtue turns predatory. Every man carries a hunger to be seen as good. It starts early, when approval feels like oxygen. Maybe your mother smiled wider when you were polite. Maybe your father only noticed you when you performed well. Praise became proof of existence. Over time, that need for goodness can harden into a moral armor. You start chasing the feeling of being unassailable, protected by virtue itself. But armor, no matter how polished, limits movement. When your identity fuses with being the good one, every disagreement starts to feel like an attack on your essence. A small critique becomes a threat to survival. You defend not just your view, but your entire right to exist as a decent person. This is the moment the halo begins to bite. Jung called this state inflation, when an archetypal force like the hero, the savior, or the moral man fuses with the ego. It's intoxicating because it feels divine. You feel lifted, larger than life, flooded with conviction. But archetypal energy doesn't belong to the ego. It belongs to the collective psyche. When you mistake that current for your own personal virtue, you start wielding it like a weapon. What began as integrity becomes crusade. Cognitive science quietly confirms the same pattern. Kahneman described confirmation bias as the brain's shortcut for protecting coherence. Once you decide you're right, your perception filters out anything that might unsettle that story. You begin collecting evidence for your own nobility. You stop listening, not because you're arrogant, but because listening would require humility, and humility feels like collapse. In relationships, this looks deceptively noble. You might say, "I'm just trying to communicate clearly," when what you're really doing is prosecuting someone else's imperfection. You might offer constructive feedback, when what you crave is reassurance that you're still the reasonable one. The persona plays defense while pretending to serve the common good. Apologies, in this state, feel like betrayals of identity, because to admit wrongness would mean dismantling the self-story you've built for safety. Your nervous system can't tell the difference between losing an argument and losing belonging, so it doubles down. The voice rises, the muscles tighten, the heart races, and all of it hides under the phrase, "I'm just being honest." Notice the irony. The more certain you feel, the less you're in touch with your actual motives. Certainty replaces curiosity. Righteousness becomes a dissociation strategy, a way to numb the anxiety of doubt. The ego says, "If I'm good, I can't be abandoned." The shadow whispers, "If I'm wrong, I might be worthless." In symbolic terms, imagine a paladin in a game. His purpose is to cleanse evil, to purify. But over time, he grows addicted to the fight itself. He needs new enemies to keep leveling up. Without realizing it, he's farming conflict to feed his own sense of worth. Every monster he slays is another hit of moral dopamine. The quest becomes self-sustaining. In real life, that addiction looks like chasing validation through constant moral contrast, seeing others as misguided so you can feel intact. And the moment praise dries up, irritation spikes. The craving for confirmation reappears. That's when the true wound surfaces. The hunger not to be right, but to be safe. This is the quiet tragedy of the halo that bites. Virtue, when used as a shield, turns predatory. It begins to feed on the very connection it claims to protect. And what was once light starts to cast a long shadow. Take a moment to recall the last time your righteousness left you lonely. Not to judge it, just to see it. Because behind every hard certainty lies a frightened tenderness, waiting for permission to be human again. In the next chapter, we'll see where this energy goes when it can't find peace. How the unlived parts of you start showing up in the people you choose. We rarely fall in love with people. We fall in love with our missing pieces wearing someone else's face. Jung called this projection, and in relationships, it becomes a stage where the psyche tries to finish an old story. What you reject in yourself, you meet across the table. What you can't forgive in others, you haven't faced within. The wound beneath this pattern is quiet, an unlived shadow, exiled and outsourced to lovers and rivals. You attract those who carry the energy you've disowned: anger, sensuality, selfishness, freedom, chaos. They embody what your upbringing told you was unacceptable. And while part of you admires their aliveness, another part condemns it. That friction creates the spark we call chemistry. Psychologically, this is the anima or animus projection, those unconscious ideals or judgments pasted onto partners. The inner feminine or masculine that lives unintegrated in you becomes externalized. The woman who appears radiant with intuition might be holding your repressed spontaneity. The man who feels decisive and grounded might be carrying your unexpressed authority. Attraction becomes a mirror, not a match. Dr. Gabor Mate would describe this repetition through the lens of compulsion. We return to the same type, not because we lack intelligence, but because we're managing pain. Each repetition offers a chance to heal the original wound, the unmet need for safety, admiration, or freedom. But without awareness, we just reenact it. The nervous system mistakes familiarity for love. The twist here is that what you call standards may actually be surveillance. Many people set rigid expectations not to honor their worth, but to anesthetize desire. Desire is unpredictable. It threatens the ego's order. So we construct a moral system around attraction, rules designed to protect us from being undone. The unconscious logic is simple. If I keep judging others, I won't have to feel what they awaken in me. Imagine Beauty and the Beast reversed. The Beast isn't trapped in the castle. He lives in your basement. You spend your energy policing beauties for signs of chaos, demanding purity from others while secretly fearing your own hunger. What you exile becomes seductive precisely because it holds the life you've denied yourself. This is how opposites bind. The moralist finds the rebel. The caretaker finds the taker. The rescuer finds the one who cannot be saved. The psyche seeks equilibrium, even through pain. Every polarized attraction is an unconscious attempt at wholeness. But instead of integrating the lost energy internally, we stage it externally, again and again, until exhaustion becomes our teacher. It's easy to say, I just have bad luck in love. But luck has little to do with it. These patterns are the psyche's intelligence working overtime. The shadow doesn't want to ruin you. It wants to be seen. When you despise the one who lies, manipulates, or abandons, part of you may also be resenting your own suppressed need for autonomy, risk, or honesty. Staying with that discomfort, without moralizing it, is the beginning of integration. Every time you resist turning away from your mirror, something shifts. You start recognizing projection as communication from your deeper self. Attraction becomes less about rescue and more about recognition. Most men turn back here. The idea that love isn't purely chosen but patterned threatens the fantasy of control. Yet behind that fear is an opening. The moment you can admit, I'm drawn to what I've buried, the pattern starts to soften. The mirror no longer commands, it collaborates. In that honesty, something new is born. The ability to love without losing yourself, and to stand close to difference without declaring war on it. That's where the shadow begins to return home. Next, we'll trace that return to its roots, to the family architecture that shaped your nervous system before you ever chose a partner. Every man's nervous system learns its first language from two sources, the mother's tone and the father's presence, or their absence. These early impressions don't just shape personality, they carve the grooves of how safety and love feel in the body. When that foundation wobbles, adulthood becomes a translation problem. You misread closeness as pressure, solitude as rejection, leadership as control, and peace as boredom. The hidden wound here lives inside those first attachments. For some, the mother's love was overmerged, every feeling absorbed, every boundary softened by care that blurred into control. For others, the father's presence was partial or absent, leaving no model for sovereignty, no example of what calm authority looks like. The result is a system that confuses fusion with safety and domination with clarity. You either cling or command, but rarely rest. Jung saw this through the lens of complexes, semi-autonomous emotional patterns that think and feel inside you, sometimes louder than your conscious will. They're not enemies, they're fragments of experience that never grew up. When triggered, these complexes borrow your voice, recruit your persona, and make you act out old negotiations with new people. One part of you says, I just want harmony, while another part is bargaining for attachment under the table. This is why conflicts with loved ones can feel outsized. You're not only arguing with the person in front of you, you're reliving an unfinished trial from your earliest years. The moral tone in your head, often inherited from the mother's echo, still judges purity and belonging. The missing father principle, the law of boundaries and self-definition, leaves the courtroom unbalanced. You either sentence yourself harshly or overrule others just to feel stable. The paradox is that both obedience and rebellion are driven by the same complex. Whether you comply or defy, you're still reacting to the same invisible authority. The costume changes, but the script doesn't. That's why a man who prides himself on independence can end up controlled by the very defiance he worships. His freedom is still a reaction, not a choice. In symbolic terms, imagine a courtroom in your mind. On one side sits the mother as judge of purity, her gaze weighing whether you are good enough. On the other side is the father's empty chair, the missing law that could balance the judgment with guidance. The trial never ends because the verdict was never meant to be final. It's a loop sustained by longing. When a man begins to recognize these voices as patterns rather than truth, the emotional charge starts to ease. The nervous system stops mistaking tension for intimacy. You begin to sense that authority doesn't have to equal control. It can mean containment. Love doesn't have to equal merging. It can mean resonance. And integrity doesn't have to mean perfection. It can mean transparency. This recognition doesn't erase pain. It contextualizes it. You stop trying to earn safety through performance and start realizing that safety is something you co-regulate, not win. The masculine initiation that was missing isn't a single ceremony. It's a slow awakening to your own capacity for steadiness. Watch how your tone shifts in conflict. That change of timbre, the moment your chest tightens, the voice sharpens, is the ghost of the early trial taking the microphone. Naming that shift isn't weakness. It's awareness reclaiming the bench from the complex. The echo and the gap are both invitations. They call you to become the father you needed and the mother who could hold without absorbing. From that integration, leadership stops being performance and starts being presence. Next, we'll explore how this unsteady inheritance shapes the way we grasp for control. Why control feels like safety until it starts eroding the very trust it was meant to protect. Control begins as care. It's the instinct to keep things from falling apart. The project, the family, the relationship, even your own composure. At first it feels noble. You're simply taking responsibility. But beneath that steady hand often lives a quiet panic. What you're really trying to prevent is the feeling of powerlessness that once felt unbearable. Control becomes the nervous system's armor against loss. The wound here hides beneath competence. Many men were rewarded for mastery, but not for vulnerability. You learned that confidence earns belonging, while uncertainty invites criticism. So leadership became a mask for fear. The tighter you grip, the more fragile everything feels. When others don't follow your script, your chest tightens, the tone sharpens, and suddenly guidance turns into pressure. You're not trying to dominate, you're trying not to disappear. Jung described this as persona possession, when the mask you wear for the world stops being a tool and starts being your identity. Boundaries become theatrical, performed strength instead of embodied steadiness. You declare limits loudly, but feel unseen underneath. Control offers temporary relief because the nervous system equates action with safety. It's the same shortcut Kahneman's System 1 takes: speed over accuracy, certainty over truth. That's why control works briefly. It stabilizes chaos for a moment, but it does so by silencing complexity. You win time, not trust. The body senses this imbalance before the mind does. There's a fatigue that follows victory, a hollowness after each solved conflict. You manage, you organize, you fix, and yet connection erodes. People begin to comply rather than collaborate. They feel your fear disguised as efficiency. Here's the paradox. Control is the anxious twin of care. They share the same heartbeat. What begins as protection slowly turns into performance. You try to prove reliability instead of embodying it. The more you manage outcomes, the less anyone feels you. Presence, the very quality that inspires trust, slips out of reach. Imagine a chess player obsessed with the clock instead of the board. Every move is made in panic. He wins seconds, but loses the game. That's what control does. It trades depth for tempo. You keep things moving, but the movement is mechanical, not alive. Over time, this habit rewires the nervous system. It creates a feedback loop. Anxiety, control, brief calm, deeper anxiety. You don't notice it happening because control feels responsible. Yet responsibility without receptivity becomes sterile. It forgets that leadership isn't about managing outcomes. It's about regulating presence. When arguments arise, the impulse to fix or teach is automatic. That impulse is the body's plea for reassurance. Underneath, a softer truth whispers, "I don't feel safe letting things unfold." The task isn't to condemn that reflex, but to understand its origins. Control is a symptom of love mixed with fear, the need to ensure connection without trusting it. When presence returns, power changes flavor. It stops being a grip and becomes a gravity, something that steadies others without forcing them. You stop managing people and start meeting them. Paradoxically, That's when things begin to align naturally. The system no longer needs micromanagement because your calmness becomes the regulating force. In the next chapter, we'll meet another form of this same pattern, the one that hides behind self-sacrifice. When control no longer keeps love close, the psyche finds another strategy, becoming indispensable. When control stops working, the psyche often shifts to a subtler defense, indispensability. If others won't let you lead, you'll make yourself essential. You'll hold the emotional fabric together, anticipate needs before they're voiced, carry the invisible load no one else can see. On the surface, it looks like generosity. Beneath it, it's a covert bargain. If I'm necessary, I won't be left. This is one of the most deceptive wounds, because it hides inside virtues our culture celebrates: service, loyalty, responsibility. But over time, the motive erodes the meaning. You stop offering care freely and start offering it as a contract. You give in order to secure belonging. Jung would say the persona has fused again, this time with the archetype of the savior. It's not dominance through force now, but through martyrdom. Dr. Gabor Mate often reminds that addiction isn't about pleasure, it's about pain relief. The man addicted to being needed is soothing the ache of invisibility. The schedule fills, the inbox floods, and exhaustion becomes a badge of worth. There's comfort in the chaos, because it silences the question, who am I if no one depends on me? The busyness covers the emptiness, but like any drug, the dose keeps rising. You start attracting relationships that feed on your overfunctioning. The more you give, the more others expect. The deeper you serve, the less they see you. And every time you collapse from fatigue, guilt drives you back for another round. You confuse depletion with devotion. Here lies the counterintuitive truth. People-pleasing is a form of control turned inward. Instead of commanding others, you manage their perception of you. You trade authenticity for approval, hoping that constant service will guarantee safety. Yet each self-erasure breeds quiet resentment. You tell yourself you're holding everyone together, but in reality, you're disappearing. Imagine a village well that never closes. At first, everyone drinks freely. The water is clear, abundant, but without rest, the source begins to muddy. Sediment rises, taste dulls. The well that once nourished the village now spreads exhaustion. That's the law of emotional ecology. Unbounded giving breeds contamination. The nervous system interprets this cycle as both purpose and punishment. You feel alive when needed and lost when alone, so even solitude becomes threatening. The man addicted to usefulness doesn't rest. He waits, waiting for the next crisis to justify his existence. To see this pattern clearly is painful, because it reveals how much of your kindness was actually fear wearing empathy's clothes. Yet in that honesty, compassion can finally grow. You begin to understand that real service is not self-erasure but self-expression, something offered from fullness, not depletion. When you stop chasing significance, a strange quiet arrives. At first it feels empty, but it's not. It's spacious. The body starts remembering what presence feels like without performance. You're no longer needed. You're known. Sooner or later, though, every strategy cracks. Control fails, indispensability collapses, and the mask of competence slips. That moment, when the system panics and the persona disintegrates, is where the deeper initiation begins. There comes a day when competence fails. The strategies that once held your world together, discipline, charm, moral certainty, suddenly stop working. Maybe it's a breakup that cuts too deep, a financial hit that shatters your image of control, or a public mistake that strips away dignity. Whatever form it takes, the system panics. Rage and numbness arrive like weather fronts. One moment fire, the next frost. And for the first time, the armor that once felt like safety begins to suffocate. This is the moment Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, the threshold of individuation. It's not a punishment, it's an initiation. Inflation deflates. The archetypal energy that had fused with the ego withdraws, and the parts of you that were exiled rush forward demanding recognition. The beast under the armor is not evil, it's the sum of everything you've refused to feel. In psychological terms, collapse is the body's way of recalibrating after chronic overextension. When the sympathetic drive of keep it together runs too long, The parasympathetic system finally overrides it. The result feels like failure, but it's actually feedback. The psyche is insisting on integration. What was split off, grief, fear, sensuality, need, is returning home. Yet collapse rarely feels redemptive in the moment. It feels humiliating. The man who once carried everything now sits among the ruins of his own competence. Relationships fray. Motivation evaporates. Faith wavers. This is the valley Jung walked through during his own breakdown, the period that birthed his most important insights. He learned that the psyche's goal is not comfort, but wholeness. And wholeness often requires descent. The counterintuitive twist is that the worst day of your life is often the most honest mirror you'll ever face. Collapse strips away the persona's performance metrics. Without the armor, you finally see what the armor was protecting. A frightened, brilliant, deeply human core. The tragedy isn't that you fell, it's that you believed falling was failure instead of feedback. Imagine the archetypal hero returning home after conquest. He expects a throne of glory and finds a throne made of mirrors. Every seat reflects the faces he exiled. The angry boy, the manipulative lover, the jealous friend, the coward, the dreamer. He realizes the kingdom he tried to control was internal all along. The beast, the one he fought so hard to suppress, is the gatekeeper of his own integration. Rage, shame, and grief are not enemies here. They're signals. They mark the places where life energy was trapped in defense. To meet them is to reclaim vitality. The task is not to conquer the beast, but to understand its language, to hear what it's been guarding all these years. Often, that message is simple. Stop performing safety. Start embodying it. As the storm settles, something unexpected appears. Clarity without pretense. The need to impress fades. You start responding instead of reacting. You stop translating every emotion into strategy. In that stillness, you can finally sense the self, the organizing center Jung described as the axis of wholeness, taking its rightful seat. Hold that image. The throne of mirrors. The man no longer at war with his reflection. The end of inflation is not collapse. It's rearrangement. The psyche isn't punishing you. It's redistributing power. The parts that were silenced become advisors. The self becomes the witness instead of the actor. And from that new center, something unshakable begins to grow. It isn't perfection or constant peace. It's presence. Now the question becomes, how do you live from this new arrangement? How do you walk the world with power that no longer needs to prove itself? The most dangerous sign was never aggression, coldness, or ambition. It was goodness. When goodness fused with identity so completely that it stopped being a virtue and became a possession. When morality hardened into armor. When the persona swallowed the self and started speaking in the voice of righteousness. That's how men lose their presence without ever raising their voice. Jung called this archetypal possession. It happens when a single idea, a single self-image, colonizes the whole psyche. You no longer have convictions. You are your convictions. Every disagreement feels existential, every apology like self-erasure. But the danger isn't that you're wrong, it's that you've become one-sided. The psyche doesn't punish imbalance with lightning, it punishes with blindness. Through this journey, you've seen how that blindness forms. It begins with virtue turning predatory, the halo that bites. Then the shadow finds other people to live through. Lovers, rivals, projections that carry your disowned emotions. The family echo amplifies the script, the mother's moral gaze, the father's absence of law. Control steps in to compensate, gripping harder each time fear whispers of loss. When control fails, the addiction to being needed takes over, translating love into usefulness. And when that usefulness collapses, the armor cracks, revealing the creature underneath, the part of you that feels everything you once outlawed. Each of these phases is a movement toward integration. The fall from certainty isn't regression, it's reconciliation. The dangerous sign is only dangerous when unseen. Once recognized, it becomes the doorway to balance. Integration begins when power and presence stop competing. When the persona, the mask you wear to navigate society, is returned to its rightful size. It becomes clothing, not skin. Useful, flexible, but removable. Beneath it, the self reclaims its seat as witness. You no longer need to prove your virtue. You simply act from coherence. You stop being good and start being whole. In this state, projections withdraw. You notice how often your criticism of others was a veiled confession. You begin to speak limits without theater, no longer as ultimatums, but as quiet statements of truth. You name your desires without apology, aware that they carry the same sacredness as your ethics. The inner courtroom starts to dissolve. The mother's echo softens. The father's gap fills with your own voice of authority. Integration doesn't make you serene all the time. It makes you real. Anger still visits. Fear still stirs. But they no longer possess you. They inform you. The self, seated at the center, listens to them like advisors instead of invaders. That's what Jung meant by individuation. Not perfection, but dialogue. The parts of you finally talking to one another. Imagine the shift as moving from a flashlight to a lantern. The flashlight narrows the beam, searching for what's wrong, blinding whatever it points at. The lantern doesn't seek, it reveals. It illuminates the whole room, letting shadow and light coexist. The man who carries that kind of light doesn't need to convince anyone. His calm is contagious, because it's not a performance, it's regulation. This is where the journey circles back to the beginning, the moment you feel morally right and strangely irritable with everyone else. That heat of certainty. The next time it rises, pause long enough to notice the deeper signal beneath it. Not to suppress it, not to correct it, but to see it. Awareness itself begins the disarmament. Peace is not the absence of fire. It's the understanding of what fuels it. Presence is not passivity. It's contact without control. Strength is not perfection. It's coherence under pressure. The dangerous sign, once integrated, becomes guidance. It reminds you that the goal was never purity. It was wholeness. The moral man who knows his shadow becomes trustworthy. The powerful man who can admit fear becomes safe. The needed man who can rest becomes human. So let the halo rest. Let the armor breathe. Let the lantern light what the flashlight could never find. You've walked through virtue, shadow, lineage, control, collapse, and return. What remains is the simplest question, the one that marks the true beginning of inner mastery. When has your certainty turned into armor? And what might happen if, instead of defending your goodness, you simply stood in your truth, unarmed, awake, and whole?